Hey, Deborah,
Hey, Brooke.
how's it going?
Oh, grand.
Nice. I actually learned before, like when I was preparing for this, that you attended William and Mary.
I
And
did.
I have to tell you, like, this was way back when I was in fourth grade. So you're not really like thinking about college as a fourth grader, but my family went to Colonial Williamsburg that year for our family vacation. And we made our way over to William and Mary, and I fell in love with that campus. In fact, I bought a t-shirt there that I still have to this day because I just thought it was the most amazing. It was like my ideal university. But tell me about your time there. What did you study? What was your major?
Well, one of the coolest things I thought was, you park and you walk down the street and you're walking down the street that very famous people would have walked down,
Right.
hundreds of years ago. And it was always just kind of a haunting feeling of all of the people that would have lived there and how important that some of them were to where our country is, and
Yeah.
all that part was really cool. I actually got my MBA there, so I
Okay.
have a MBA that I picked up. I was going to school part-time and working full-time, so that was fun.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite sandwich places is right next to campus. So I would, every once in a while, I would pick up a sandwich and for dinner and go to class. But yeah, it's a beautiful campus, and they
Yes.
had our graduation ceremony then in a building that Thomas Jefferson was in when he
Wow.
graduated, and it was just really all this cool history stuff
Yeah.
was pretty exciting. And as locals, we got free access to the Colonial Williamsburg at the time. And
Oh,
so that
nice.
was always nice. We would go quite often.
Yeah. Yeah. See, that's something you don't really get out here in the Western states is all that history. The states are just so much more new out in this direction, but I love being able to travel out that way and get that history and be part of it. So what a cool way to get an MBA. Now, is that something that led into you because you own a consulting company now, correct?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that probably contributed to you being able to start that company.
Well, it certainly helped because
Yeah.
I had all of the marketing classes and all of the accounting. Accounting was really
Right.
useful. I mean, as a software developer, you don't really think about needing to know accounting, but it was really helpful in trying to, get a company going, to know how to, do your books and track all of the expenses and all of that kind of stuff correctly, and finance. And I had quite a few management courses that were helpful. And so, yeah, I think all of that really helped in getting to the business side of running a company, as opposed to just, the technology side, which of course is extremely important, but you also have to be running a business and dealing with taxes and employees and those kind of things.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Well, I love hearing everybody's stories into not just programming, but like with this consulting that you've done and such fascinating stories. But one thing with this roadmap to learning Angular series is I'm trying to help people to really maximize their learning with Angular. And so much of when you think of learning how to code, learning Angular, a lot of it is watching tutorials and going through online courses. And that was exactly why I asked you here. I just don't think it gets any better than having Deborah Kurata. We were just talking a minute ago about your work with Pluralsight, and how I've kind of always in my mind pictured, I'm calling you the Angular 10. There may be only 8 of you, but I still think there were, around there where there were a handful of you original authors who really helped Pluralsight get launched because of your incredible teaching abilities in these courses that you would put out. And I mean, literally, like is it kind of weird to think about how many thousands of people go through these courses and how many people you've taught?
It's an absolutely wonderful feeling to uh, have the ability to help people in that way. And at ng-conf just not too long ago, when they introduced me as, you know, the person that you probably learned Angular from. And
Right.
it's just a really good feeling of being able to have helped people, and especially in technology, because so many really good technologists are really bad at explaining things.
Right.
You know, if you've ever had a problem at work and gone to a coworker who is really smart and asked them to explain something, sometimes you're just like, I don't understand any of what they just told
Yeah.
me, or, you know, they kind of skip steps because, you know, it's so obvious to them or whatever. So it's nice to feel like you can make a difference.
Yeah. Yeah. When, you know, I think it's important too that you've kind of gone through the trenches, so to say, right? Like you, like I said, you own your own consulting company in Step Technologies, and you work as a software developer. But then, as you pointed out, you're also a well sought after speaker. You're a GDE MVP. I mean, it just keeps going on and on. You have an active YouTube channel that you've just revived with some free courses on there. You have 21 courses on Pluralsight, and I'm sure that's and counting. We can probably say there will be more, but yeah, I mean, like I said, I just think you're the perfect person for this topic to come in and really help people to understand how can I, when I sit down to go through an online course on Angular, how can I really maximize that time and make sure that things aren't just coming in and immediately going out? Because I think that is one challenge with these online programs is you have these objectives, you have the course, you see all of the videos you need to get through, and it's sort of like, all right, let's do this. And you just go straight through it, but you don't actually take the time to really let things settle. And that's what I want to help break down, is helping people to really understand how can I retain that information so that I'm not just kind of in zombie mode going through the course.
Yeah.
But
there are two things that I would suggest. First of all, to come in with the correct prerequisites. And I know that's really hard because I just want to learn Angular. I just want to go in and learn Angular. But you go in and none of the words make sense. I mean, I've had several people reach out to me. One of the other nice things about Pluralsight's courses is it has a discussion group so that the person can go and say, hey, I'm stuck. And especially early on, I had quite a few people say, you know, there were all these new terms that were new to me. But the problem was a lot of those new terms are HTML and CSS. Yeah. And things that were kind of prerequisites coming in. And so I think sometimes in the rush to learn Angular, that people are coming in really kind of unprepared. Yeah. Which is one of the reasons why I wanted to do these courses that are free, of course, on YouTube. I have a whole HTML course. It's called Gentle Introduction to HTML for Beginners. Nice. And it really focuses on all of the correct terminology. I mean, I've watched quite a few HTML YouTube videos that just show you stuff, but they don't actually go through what is a property, what is an attribute, what is a element, what are those things? Because if you're going to continue in your career, you're going to read stuff, you're going to take Angular courses that are using element and attribute, and you're like, oh my God, all these new terms. Yeah, they're not new Angular terms, they're HTML terms, and they shouldn't be new to somebody coming in trying to learn Angular. Yeah. So I think that's really important, to come in with the right prerequisites. And again, it's so hard. You just want to take that 4-hour course and learn Angular and be done. But coming in with the prep really can significantly improve your experience with learning Angular. Yeah. The second thing, and it's also one of those, you know, oh my God, do I really have to? But the second thing I would recommend is to actually watch the course twice. Okay. So to start the first time, maybe even a little faster, because on most of these things, YouTube and Pluralsight, you can up the speed. So you
Right.
can listen to it at 1.4 or 1.5 or whatever, and just listen to the course first. Get the concepts, get the terms. What does this word mean? What does, what is a component? What is RxJS? All of those different terms that you need to know. Then watch it a second time at normal speed and code along. A lot of the Angular content on Pluralsight is set up to be coded along with. Coded along, is that English correct?
It is now.
to actually work through so that you're sitting on your keyboard and you are creating this application along with the course. Because so often you can listen to the course and go, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. And you get to the keyboard and you're like, okay, now what do I type in?
Right.
So by coding along, but it's really hard, I think, your first time through the material, if you're brand new to Angular, to try to listen to the concepts and do the code along. So I find it useful, like you're on a trip, you can be listening to the video on your trip, and then when you get back to the office, listen to it again and do the coding along part.
There you go.
And I think that really kind of helps make it, stay.
Yeah.
And take advantage of, the discussion groups. Ask questions if you're stuck, because that's I said I had two, but that's probably a third thing, is to reach out for help if something isn't making sense, because if you get stuck, then that next concept might be even harder to get because you didn't quite capture that prior one.
Right. Yeah. Kind of taking ownership of your own learning, being actively involved rather than just passively watching.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So I want to get more into your story as well, because I think taking advice from someone, it helps to understand where they've come from and your experiences yourself as a learner, and how, because I can tell already you have a sense of empathy with your students. Just, some of the things you've already said of the experiences they go through and those moments of getting stuck and things. And so I want to ask you more about your journey into programming, but I do want to play a game with you first, if that's okay. I think it's fun to kind of get to know Deborah Kurata, besides Deborah, the author, the the one who's taught everybody Angular. Let's get to know Deborah a little bit on a different side here. So I have a game that I heard from a local radio station. I cannot claim that I came up with this game, but I really liked the idea, because I think sometimes we always ask people their favorite whatever, their favorite food, their favorite treat. But this one is called Things That Must Go. And I liked it because it's not your favorite. It's your least favorite, things that you think that probably should just go. We don't need them. Let's get rid of them. So do you have one or two that you could share?
Well, I actually took on, would sort of like to go in a serious direction with it, I guess, if I can.
Yeah.
I would like to see divisiveness go.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's bad for all of us, not just here in the US, but everywhere, because it is everywhere. I think it's really important as we're, moving into the early parts of a new year, that we kind of make it a goal to do what we can. So there are three things that I've promised myself I'm going to work on in 2023 to help with divisiveness. And the first one is practicing empathy, whether you're talking to your, crazy uncle, or sitting at your grandparents' house, or talking to your neighbors. Try to see things from their perspective.
Yeah.
We have, now that my parents are getting older, I've been trying to get home at least 3 times a year, and finding that talking to my mother is like almost talking to someone from another planet these days, because she keeps telling me that she doesn't watch the same news that I do.
Right.
It's like, what's that all about?
Yeah.
So trying to empathize with her and how she is viewing things and how she is seeing things, and try to communicate openly and honestly about, questions that she might have. I mean, we ended up in a big conversation about how, voting in California isn't something like voting for prom where you can just stuff things in the mailbox and they're going to count all those votes. And,
Right.
because we do 100% mail-in voting here. And I explained to her how mail-in voting works. And she had some questions about, okay, how do homeless people vote? And we spent some time and looked that up on the internet and, it was interesting to find that answer. But, to communicate and to seek common ground in these things, like we all of us want to have safe voting, for example. So how do we get there? I mean, different people have different opinions, but let's emphasize with their opinion and communicate openly. And my other hope is that Twitter survives, but
yeah.
we'll see how that goes.
Good old Twitter. Yeah, you're right. Time will tell with that one. It is interesting though, because when I was thinking of what I think should go, my thoughts were revolving around very much the same thing. And it's this cancel culture that I think I understand where people are coming from. I understand why they would want to, quote unquote, cancel someone. But I do think that we're all human beings. And I think it is dangerous to want to cancel a human being, and to instead, I think, like what you're saying, just be more empathetic, being open to conversations, being willing to listen to other people's side to things. And I think if we just were a little bit more open like that things could start to make more improvement. They could change in the right ways. So yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that is very much where my thoughts were as well. But all right,
well, we can disagree, but we don't need to be mean.
Right, exactly. Yes, thank you. That was the perfect way to end that thought. So amazing. But okay, so now we've put out these good vibes into the universe. Let's talk about learning Angular a little bit more. And as I said, I love learning people's stories, and I think it helps to understand, where did Deborah come from? What was Deborah like as a learner? And so I'd love to hear the story of how you discovered programming. How did you get into it? What were your first experiences with code?
When I was in high school, we had basic programming was all that my high school had, because I'm a little bit on the older side. In college, I got a job in the computer lab, and what we were doing was computer-based training courses. So we were trying to teach people chemistry. And the woman that I worked with at the time taught me structured programming, which, I hadn't heard of. I just had a basic course where you just type lines sequentially. And so she taught me about functions, and that every piece of code had its place somewhere. You don't just type, 200 lines of code in a row. Everything has its place, and everything is neat, and naming conventions and best practices and error handling, and a lot of the basics of programming that have stuck with me for those several years since college were really fundamentally important. And I think her way of explaining them really gave me a lot of good ideas of how to explain things. And as a learner, one of the very irritating things that I used to do is run around and ask everybody if I didn't get something. So back in the day, my first actual job then that I got after college was at a software company. And we were also doing computer-based training for the military. So we were working with the Army and trying to do online training for some of their technical areas. And if I didn't get something, I would run around and ask somebody. And if they didn't explain it well enough to me, I'd go to somebody else and have them explain it to me. And if I still didn't understand it, I just kept bugging people until I found a person who explained it in words that I understood.
Yeah.
And again, I think, as you said, those struggles kind of opened my eyes to how hard it is on some of these technical concepts to explain them well enough for someone who is relatively new.
Right.
And I think that kind of gave me some empathy moving forward.
Yeah.
Because some of these things really confused me. There was some odd thing called a null device. And I must have asked 8 different people what it was till I finally found somebody who explained it to me in words that I understood.
Yeah.
But it was basically in-memory storage.
Yeah.
And that's all that it was. But the way that it was used in the code, and they all made it sound sort of mysterious and magic, and they just made it so much harder than it needed to be.
Just simplify. Right.
Yeah.
But see, now that's something I want to get into here in a minute as well, because I think with learning, asking questions really is important, because you, as I said earlier, that idea of becoming an active participant in your learning rather than just passively listening or watching. So I definitely want to put a pin in that and come to that here in a minute. But when did Angular come into the picture then? So, how did you already have a job at that point, or was that more early on?
My husband also works with my consulting company. After it was successful early on, he quit his job and joined.
Nice.
So we both work for the consulting company. And he had a client who was doing Angular. So he learned it first. And then I was doing a big .NET project for a client and had to do a web piece. And I didn't really want to do ASP because it was going to be, I thought, a little too much to deal with, because as a consultant, you've got to give all that code to them to maintain afterwards.
Right.
So I wanted to give them something simpler. And my husband said, hey, my client's working with Angular. And this was Angular 1.2. So it was the old version of Angular.
Yeah.
And so he got me started with it. And I asked him a gazillion questions, and I went to the store and bought every book that I could have, because back when Angular first started out, they didn't have too much in terms of online training.
Yeah.
So I really dove into it and worked on it with this client and found that I just absolutely loved it, because like I had originally learned, Angular kind of suggests kindly that every bit of code has a place, and and everything has a well-defined way that it should be, and that just kind of appealed to my background of how I had learned to code, and so it felt very comfortable and very natural. And coming from .NET, TypeScript was just like, oh yeah, I know how to basically do that. That made it easier to learn, especially when they went to the newer version of Angular and it was all TypeScript based. But
yeah. Now, I think this is an interesting question, but did you find anything yourself that was particularly challenging? Like when you were first learning Angular, was there something that really stands out to you as, wow, that was hard? And how did you push through that? What were some strategies that you did to learn, and get through that?
I actually thought RxJS was confusing. And it took me a while to figure out what it was. And when it finally kind of clicked that, again, coming from .NET, that RxJS was very similar to how Link worked, then it sort of all started to click for me. And then not too many years ago, I had a conversation with Aaron Frost about reactive Angular. And he kind of introduced me to a couple of things that just really made it all make sense at a much broader level than just the basics of it being kind of link-like and how you get data. It became much more of a very useful tool and a way to work with any kind of data. So I went from, I don't really know what this is, to I get it now, it's kind of like this, to, oh my gosh, it can actually do so much more. And over the course of numerous Angular revisions.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my journey.
I love that though, because I know that you've given multiple talks on RxJS. You have at least one course on it as well, if not more. And so I love that you like dove into it enough to become, skilled and then be able to turn around and teach other people. But that kind of leads me to my next question, which is, at what point in your career did you start to want to teach other people and know that making courses was something that this is no easy thing? When I was working at Thinkster with Joe, making a course is a tremendous amount of time and effort, and you have to go and do some very tedious, meticulous work. It takes a unique person, I think, to actually start and finish the project. It speaks volumes of the people who do, I think, but at what point did you say, I want to go and do that?
When I was in high school, I had wanted to be a teacher.
Okay.
I actually joined the Future Teachers of America, which
Nice.
I don't know if they even have clubs like that anymore back these days.
So,
but,
yeah, I think so.
I actually got to volunteer at the local elementary school that was down the street from our high school. I would walk over there and help the teacher one afternoon a week. And I realized then that little kids was not the audience that I was that interested in. I mean, it's not like I don't like little kids, but
it's a lot.
Teaching that age was not going to be my cup of tea. So it's good that I volunteered and experienced it and realized that wasn't where I wanted to go. But I still always liked the idea of being a teacher, of sharing knowledge, of coming up with metaphors and ways to explain things and visuals. I love learning with visuals because sometimes that can be so helpful in picturing how something works. When I was first learning programming, one of the things that I did was join a news group, or it was CompuServe at the time, probably never heard of it, but it basically was sort of a Stack Overflow, only significantly more friendly. And I would try to learn coding. I was trying to learn Visual Basic at the time. Okay. So this was quite a few years ago. And I found that one of the best ways to learn it was to go up and try to answer questions. So somebody would ask a question and I would research it, and I would try stuff, and then I would figure out the answer, and then I would try to figure out how to explain it. And I found that going and answering people's questions and trying to explain things like that helped me learn the language so much better, and the tools and all that came with it at the time. And this was, probably 20 years ago, that was really helpful. And so the more that I helped others, the more I learned it better. And so that really made it motivational for me to continue to do that. So that's how I originally got my Microsoft MVP, because they saw me answering questions on these forums, and did it that way. And then when Stack Overflow came to be, I tried to help on there a little bit, though I frequently feel that it's just so negative. I kind of hate hanging out there too much, but if there's a specific question, I can give a specific answer and hopefully not get attacked too badly. I'll still go out and try to help people. But frequently beginners there are shut down so fast that you don't even get a chance to answer their question before people have just criticized the heck out of them and scared them away. What's the point of that for a community?
Right. Yeah. Well, and it goes back to that idea of empathy, right? And I've had this conversation with Lucas Rubelke when I interviewed him, and he was pointing out and reminding us that learning doesn't happen when you're in an environment where you feel in danger or where you're not
Intimidated.
safe. Yeah.
Mhm.
So going somewhere and feeling challenged or put down, it's not a good place to effectively learn. So yeah, but all right, so here you are now, you've made 21 courses plus all of this other content, given all of these presentations at conferences, which I think in their own right, they are courses, right? It's a condensed course of sorts, and I want to go back a little bit to that comment you were making earlier about being prepared and making sure that you're not just getting into Angular maybe a little bit too prematurely, but what are some things specifically that you would recommend for an Angular course, like a fundamentals intro to Angular, aside from HTML, CSS, and some JavaScript? What are some things that you would recommend to people to really prepare themselves for the course?
Well, I think those things that you mentioned are kind of the top things. One of the things that Pluralsight does is they allow us to update our content. So when I first did the Angular 2 course, I got a lot of questions. And so when Angular 4 came out, I did an update to the course and I revised it to include the answers to those questions. So somebody's like, I don't get how get and set work. And so I added a little segment on how get and set work in Angular. And somebody else had trouble with NPM. And so now I have a section on what is NPM and how does it work? And because that's really important, because everything starts, NPM start,
Right.
NPM install. So those are very Angular-y things you need to do that aren't really Angular. And so I added quite a few of those kinds of things to the course so that you didn't have to completely learn NPM before you come in. So I do try to cover some of the basic TypeScript kind of syntax, kind of explain what all of those things are and why they are like that, and what dependency injection means. And that's not Angular specific either, but a lot of people coming into Angular might not be familiar with that concept.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important for Angular content, especially beginner Angular content, to just take a moment where possible and kind of give just that little bit of extra information on, not just, in order to get a service to work, you've got to inject it in, to actually explain what does that mean? What is that doing when you're doing that?
Right.
Why is that important? What happens if you don't do it? What doesn't work? How do you know that might be what you did wrong? And so to try to include that as much as possible into the learning, because it's really hard to necessarily learn all of that before coming in.
Right. And even being aware of what exactly to know.
Right. So, yeah.
When I like that you mentioned earlier too, with certain platforms like Pluralsight, there is the ability to go in and ask questions. It's not something every platform offers. So I definitely think it's a bonus, a major benefit of using Pluralsight. But one thing I know, like from my teaching, I did go through the throes of teaching children, Deborah. It was fun. It was fun, but questioning, I think, is underestimated, and you're hitting on that right here, where being able to ask yourself, did I understand this enough that I could turn around and explain it well enough to somebody else? But I think in order to get to that point, you have to be asking questions. And likewise, though, I think the instructors, if they can ask questions of their students, even in an online course, and I know you do this is why I'm mentioning it, because you pose questions to your students and it gets them thinking about, well, how would I answer that? And I would just encourage, people going through your courses to pause the course, really give it thought. Think about how you would answer that rather than just letting Deborah explain it in the next breath, right? Give it some real reflection, because I think that when you do that, that's when you start to make those connections and things really start sinking in.
Yeah, I like to ask often, why didn't that work? Okay, we did this, and it didn't work. Why didn't it work? To help, because that's the question you're going to end up asking yourself when you're actually coding in Angular. You're going to do something that's like, okay, why didn't that work? And then we kind of work together to figure out why it didn't work.
Right.
It's like, oh yeah, we talked about 3 steps. We only did 2 of those 3 steps. We got to do that 3rd step, or whatever it was.
Well, and the value there, you're pointing out too, the value of showing learners that not everything goes perfectly like you expect it to, and problem solving. And I think that's valuable to keep that content in the video is, well, that didn't go the way I wanted, but here's how we're going to solve it. Here's how we're going to debug or problem solve to work through this. So that makes me curious though. What are some of the most common tripping points you've found as someone's gone through, I guess, particularly with your fundamentals of Angular courses? What are some tripping points or barriers that you find when people come to blah, to some concept? What is it that's most often hardest for them to grasp at first?
Well, definitely NPM is a challenge for a lot of people. Just in its nature, it doesn't always work. Version issues are constantly a problem. And so it's a big stumbling block for someone getting started with Angular to start off right away. I need to do an NPM install and it's not working because I have an old version of NPM, or worse yet, I have the newest version of NPM, which doesn't work with Angular because they always want to work with the long-term LTS version. And so I think that's frequently one of the first stumbling blocks. And for a while, that was what I was getting the most questions about. I can't get past step 1. I can't get my NPM install to work. I think RxJS, as we've talked about before, is a big one. I think that there are a lot of web developers who don't necessarily have in their head how the web actually works. When you issue an HTTP GET request, it's not like calling a function. You don't call a function. Well, when you call a function, you call it, you get an answer back. When you do an HTTP GET request, you're just making the request and then you're continuing on. It doesn't wait. So in Angular, you issue an HTTP GET, you're not getting back the data. You're getting back an observable.
Right.
And that observable is just going to wait and observe and sit and observe until that HTTP response finally comes back. So in the meantime, that request has gone to a server somewhere. It's been processed by some code on that server. Maybe it had to do a database lookup, call a stored procedure, get the data back. And it's doing all of this stuff. And your Angular code is just continuing on with whatever else it was doing.
Right.
Finally, it has the data and it sends it back. And at that point, then you have that response and that observable emits a value. So it's very async. And I think that concept is not necessarily, even web developers who are doing HTML and CSS that are coming into Angular don't necessarily have that mental process of request, sometime later response in their heads. And so they'll put a console statement to log the result right after that GET, and that data is just not there yet because it hasn't come back. And so that's another, big stumbling block that I've seen is, you can't request the data and then print it because you don't have that data back yet.
Yeah.
So I think that's another big one. And then forms is a whole nother story.
Yeah, kind of its own beast. And it has courses. There are courses just on forms. But you did point out one too, I think that is good for people to come in having prepared. Like if they're gonna be preparing for an Angular course, we have HTML, CSS, JavaScript, but you also mentioned just installations. things like that. I think getting familiar with Git is really essential as well. So those are some good ones.
Yeah, one of the other courses on my YouTube channel is Gentle Introduction to GitHub for beginners. So
well, there you go. There will, by the way, everybody, be a link to Deborah's YouTube in the description of this video. So definitely click on that link, because there's at least 4. You have at least 4 courses on there that are totally free.
4 right now, and I'm working on 2 more to finish this set. So I'm doing, I've got Gentle Introduction to Programming, HTML, GitHub, CSS, and I'm working on Bootstrap and JavaScript.
Okay. Wow. Thank you. I honestly, like, from the community, thank you for that. I think that's really generous of you to make those. We've talked about RxJS here a handful of times. You're not the only person that says it's a difficult concept to learn. Everybody, I think, would agree with you. What are some things that you think make RxJS so difficult to learn? Like, and we don't need to get so specific, but just kind of from a higher level perspective, like, why is it that it's so hard even for more advanced developers to really grasp this concept?
Well, one of the things I think is that it has its own terminology. And so the first thing that you're struggling with is, what do all those words mean? And so you read through the documentation, and the documentation has gotten better over the last several years. They're continuing to work to improve it, and it has become a little bit more user-friendly. But I remember first reading it, and it would say, and then the inner observable, and then the outer observable. And I'm like, what the heck is an inner observable and an outer observable? I don't know what those words mean. And you Google it, and you don't really get anything. And I think that one of the problems that people struggle with right away with it is the words, the terms, and that. And then the second part is what I talked about before, is just the whole idea of request and response, and that you don't get that data right away. Right. And so I think people coming from .NET sometimes have an easier time with RxJS than people coming from other areas, especially coming just from HTML and CSS, because some people coming to Angular come from web development.
Right.
Some people come to Angular from .NET. Some people come from other things like React or Vue. But the people coming from .NET already have LINQ, which is very similar conceptually to the pipelines that RxJS can do. And so as soon as you know that that's the way you need to think about it, then kind of the curtain opens and you sort of get how RxJS works. But that's not helpful for people who don't know what LINQ is. Yeah. So I am going to be starting again this coming year, speaking at .NET conferences and introducing RxJS to them is a whole different, there's a whole different set of vocabulary that I use and explaining RxJS to them than I do to not .NET people, because of the similarities that you can draw between the two technologies. So
how are you breaking things down? What is it that you do that helps students to get that aha moment with RxJS? Is, aside from the vocabulary, because that's definitely, I think, important, like you're saying, but is there something that you feel like is really, that stands out to you as something that, like, whenever I teach in this way, or I share this bit of information, this analogy, whatever it is there something that you feel like really makes RxJS more approachable for people to understand?
Well, I do normally start any kind of introduction or intro content to RxJS with a lot of metaphors to help with the terminology. So we go through what an observable looks like and how it kind of moves. And if you're doing a video or a presentation where you could do a PowerPoint with animation, you can kind of see how the data is moving with RxJS. The other things kind of similar, you try to come up with metaphors, like for the difference between merge map, switch map, and concat map. I did a Olympics thing,
Nice.
because one is like a relay race and the other one's more like the 400 meter. And so you can kind of do metaphors to explain some of the concepts. I like to do a lot of visuals, a lot of metaphors, and a lot of examples. And then just be really careful with the terminology. And especially with a longer video, is every once in a while you refresh what that terminology means. So you would say again, recall that an observable is blah, blah, blah. I did that in a couple of my getting started, my Angular getting started course too, because I had people say, I still don't get what a component is or what a service is or whatever. So every time I would bring it up again, I would add the one sentence, recall that a service is blah, blah, blah. Recall that a component is blah, blah, blah. So that would hopefully help a little bit of repetition.
Yeah, totally. So a couple more questions for you, but just to kind of, I think I want to pause here and really point some things out that I keep hearing you bring up, and things that I think are important for anybody watching this to really make note of, which is, first of all, you keep, really emphasizing that vocabulary. And I think that's so important because here's the thing, like, online courses are so helpful in so many ways, but they have major disadvantages as well. You're not there in person with the teacher. You can't ask questions live in the moment. There's not somebody right there with you, but they have advantages to them in that you can pause, you can rewatch things as many times as you need. There are some, like Pluralsight, that offer the forums where you can go and ask questions. But ultimately, at the end of the day, your learning is your responsibility. You can find an excellent course, and Deborah makes the best you can find, but your learning is still your learning, and you have to take some initiative. And I think that's, one thing it starts with is learning that vocabulary, getting really familiar and comfortable with what is being said, the certain phrases, terminology, the syntax that's being used. You also mentioned, though, a number of times using metaphors. And even if the course that you're going through doesn't give good metaphors, as Deborah's saying, you can come up with your own. Turn around and teach someone else, even if it's a rubber duck, right? We got rubber ducks at ng-conf, and I've got mine right here. And if you need to sit there and explain something to someone until you understand that concept, come up with your own metaphors, come up with your analogies, give an example like Deborah's with the Olympics. I think that's brilliant. Come up with these things that help you understand them. And the last thing that you mentioned, I think, is really important, is going back and making sure that you're not just zipping through a course start to finish. But if your instructor, again, Deborah gives top-notch courses. She's baking it into her course where she's asking you to go back and recall information that she's presented earlier. But not every course is made that with that quality. And so make sure you're going back and really revisiting topics and figuring out, well, this was mentioned earlier. How is it related to what I'm doing now? Three chapters later, 3 modules later. I think these are all really important.
Yeah, and as a programmer, sometimes you think, well, it doesn't matter what it's called as long as I know the right code. But the problem is, if you don't know the right words for what it's called, you try to read an article, you try to Google something. Have you ever tried to Google something when you don't remember what something is called? I mean, you try to kind of guess other words until you hopefully get something close. But without knowing what that particular word is, you can't Google well. You can't understand the documentation. So as much as, I just need the code, because I just need to code it. I don't care if it's called a service or I don't care if it's called dependency injection. I just need to know the syntax. But if you're stuck, if you have a problem, if you don't know the exact right word for what it's called, it's really difficult to ask a question or find help. Because even asking the question, if you don't know the right word, people aren't going to be able to to help you, because they're not going to understand what it is that you don't understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally. So, all right, like I said, last couple of questions here. And one of them is more in general. We've talked about some specifics with learning the fundamentals of Angular or even something like RxJS, but more in general now, what are some study suggestions that you would give to people learning Angular, be that a junior developer learning Angular in general, or even a more advanced developer who's learning something very particular? Like, is there something that you would say is really helpful for truly retaining information?
I think pretty much anything programming, in order to really retain it, one of the things you need to do is just use it. So you need to use it in your code. And if your company isn't necessarily doing it, like say you want to learn NX or NGRX or one of those higher end libraries or frameworks that go with Angular, your company doesn't want to do it, but you want to learn it, then you're going to want to still code it. Code yourself a little side project, keep track of your friends list, or whatever, your CD collection or your collectibles, or whatever, something, so that you're actually doing it. Because just reading about NX or just reading about NGRX or just reading about RxJS, I mean, you're not going to really have it sink in and really understand it unless you've coded it.
Yeah.
If you have the opportunity to explain it to someone else too, as we've talked about before, I think that that's a really good way to help you retain it. And I wish there was a place like the old CompuServe where you could go help people, because I sort of hate pointing people to Stack Overflow. But if you can find a place like that, maybe there's an internal Slack channel to help other developers in your company, participate in something like that to help, because that will strengthen your understanding of it. And as they ask you questions, then you have to think through it and maybe think of other ways to be explaining it. And that really helps solidify it in your head also.
The Angular Discord can be a good resource for that at times. So definitely check out Angular Discord. All right, last question is just in general, do you have any like final advice that you would give to developers where, just how can they really maximize their learning, be that online courses or not? Is there advice that you would give as kind of a final note here?
As you've mentioned, just taking personal responsibility. Your company can suggest that you learn something, but unless you're going to actually take personal responsibility to learn and you have to kind of want to learn it. I think that that's the most fundamental thing. If you are really interested in a topic, just to dive into it. I mean, back in the day when I was wanting to learn a technology, I would dive into everything I could find. I would go in the bookstore and back in the day before you could find everything online, just sit in the bookstore reading all of these different technical books. Like when C# first came out, you kept going to the library or to the bookstore. Is there a new C# book yet out? Because I'm trying to read them like crazy. Taking that responsibility, kind of pumping up that drive to really learn something well, I think is important.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely right. But thank you so much. Like everything you've shared, I feel like is so valuable. And it really is. These are good reminders for people, because you're right. There's that excitement and that eagerness when you're just getting into a technology, into a framework of just jump in, like, let's do this. And I'll be honest, like my first introduction with it was actually like someone gave me the advice that you can learn Angular without knowing the fundamentals. You can do Angular and be successful without. So don't worry so much about learning those basics. Just dive right into Angular. And while I understand what that person was trying to say, I do think that there's a lot of value, and it is important to be building your skills together. Like you can still be learning Angular while you're still mastering HTML and CSS. And I think just giving yourself that time to balance it. You don't have to do 100% Angular every day. Find some time to do both and really balance out your learning. But if anybody would like to connect with you, Deborah, I know you're quite active on Twitter. And like we said, we hope Twitter survives this, whatever it's going through. But people can find you at, and it's exactly your name. So Deborah is DEBORAH, and then Kurata is KURATA. So you can find her there. And then, as I said, I'll put in links to her different like channels, places where you can find her courses in the description to this video.
I also have I forgot what YouTube is calling it, but a tag. So it's at Deborah_Kurata. I couldn't get just Deborah Kurata for some reason. So it's pretty much just like my Twitter with the at in the front. So if you go www.youtube.com/@Deborah_Kurata, you'll get all my stuff.
Okay, I'm adding that right now to my notes so I don't forget. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.